When 38-year-old Derek Lansing failed to return from what should have been a routine 3-day bear hunting expedition in the remote wilderness surrounding Ketchikan, Alaska, his wife Patricia knew something had gone terribly wrong. Derek was a creature of habit, a man whose punctuality was as reliable as the tides. He had never missed a check-in, never been late for dinner, and never broken a promise to his family. The silence from the forest was deafening, and it carried with it the weight of unimaginable dread. Derek Lansing was the kind of man Alaska seemed designed to create. Born and raised in the rough fishing town of Ketchikan, he had spent his entire life navigating the unforgiving wilderness that stretched endlessly beyond the town's borders. At 38, he was a seasoned outdoorsman with nearly 2 decades of hunting experience carved into the deep lines around his eyes. His hands were calloused from years of handling rifles and gutting game, and his weathered face told the story of countless dawn mornings spent in pursuit of black bear through the dense temperate rainforest that blanketed southeastern Alaska. He worked as a commercial fisherman during the summer months, pulling long shifts on the frigid waters of the Inside Passage. But autumn was his sanctuary, the season when he would disappear into the wilderness for days at a time, returning with stories and sometimes meat to last through the harsh winter. His wife Patricia had long ago made peace with these solitary expeditions. She understood that the forest wasn't just Derek's hobby, it was his church, his therapy, and his deepest connection to the land that had shaped him. The morning of October 15, 2013, Derek had kissed Patricia goodbye at their small cabin on the outskirts of Ketchikan. The air was crisp with the promise of an early winter, and the surrounding mountains were already dusted with snow. He loaded his gear into his battered pickup truck with the methodical precision of a man who had performed this ritual hundreds of times before. His rifle, a well-maintained Winchester that had belonged to his father, was secured in its case. His backpack contained 3 days' worth of provisions, emergency supplies, and the small satellite communicator that Patricia had insisted he carry after a close call the previous year. Derek's hunting plan was straightforward and well-rehearsed. He intended to access a remote section of the Tongass National Forest through an old logging road that wound deep into the mountains east of town. The area was known for its healthy black bear population, and Derek had taken several animals from the region over the years. His target zone was a series of berry-rich valleys roughly 15 miles from the nearest paved road, accessible only by foot once the logging road became impassable to vehicles. His timeline was equally precise. He would drive as far as the road would allow, probably about 12 miles into the forest, then hike the remaining distance to his preferred hunting area. He planned to establish a basic camp near a small creek he knew well, spend 2 full days hunting and return home by Sunday evening. It was a conservative plan designed around his intimate knowledge of the terrain and his respect for the wilderness's inherent dangers. Patricia waved goodbye from their front porch as Derek's truck disappeared down the gravel road, its red taillights swallowed by the morning mist. It was a scene they had enacted dozens of times before, but this time would be the last. She went about her weekend routine, working in the small garden they maintained behind the cabin and catching up on household tasks that accumulated during Derek's fishing season. Sunday evening came and went without his familiar headlights turning into their driveway. By Monday morning, Patricia's concern had crystallized into genuine alarm. She called Derek's hunting partner, Bobby Nash, hoping Derek might have extended his trip and simply forgotten to call. Bobby was surprised to learn Derek was even in the woods. They hadn't planned any joint expeditions, and Derek had never mentioned his weekend plans. Patricia's next call was to the Ketchikan Police Department, where she spoke to Officer Greg Walsh, a patient man who had fielded hundreds of similar calls over his 20-year career. Walsh took down the basic information and assured Patricia that most overdue hunters turned up within a few hours with mechanical problems or minor injuries. Derek's satellite communicator should have allowed him to call for help if he was truly in distress, and the fact that no emergency signal had been received was actually reassuring. Nevertheless, Walsh filed an official missing person report and contacted the Alaska State Troopers, who had jurisdiction over the vast federal lands where Derek was hunting. By Tuesday morning, when Derek had been missing for 4 full days, the situation escalated from routine concern to active emergency response. Trooper Sergeant Tom Bridges, a veteran of Alaskan wilderness rescues, was assigned to coordinate the search effort. Bridges was a careful, methodical man who understood that the difference between a successful rescue and a body recovery often came down to organization and speed. The October weather was deteriorating rapidly, with early season storms bringing freezing rain and snow to the higher elevations where Derek was believed to be hunting. The search began with the logical starting point of Derek's abandoned truck. A team of volunteer searchers, many of them local hunters familiar with the terrain, followed the old logging road until they found Derek's pickup parked at a familiar spot roughly 14 miles from the main highway. The truck was unlocked, and a quick inventory confirmed that Derek's essential hunting gear was missing, indicating he had successfully begun his planned expedition. Fresh tire tracks in the soft earth confirmed the vehicle had been parked recently, and there were no signs of struggle or foul play. From the truck's location, search teams on foot began following the network of game trails and old logging paths that Derek would likely have used to reach his hunting area. The terrain was challenging, a maze of steep valleys choked with dense undergrowth and fallen timber. Visibility was often limited to just a few yards in any direction, and the constant drizzle made tracking nearly impossible. Teams called Derek's name continuously, their voices echoing off the valley walls and disappearing into the thick canopy of spruce and hemlock. Helicopter support was brought in from Juneau, but the aircraft's effectiveness was severely limited by the weather and the dense forest cover. Pilots reported that even with thermal imaging equipment, the thick canopy made it nearly impossible to spot anything on the forest floor. The helicopters were most useful for transporting search teams to remote areas that would have taken hours to reach on foot, but the fundamental work of looking for Derek remained a ground-level operation conducted in increasingly difficult conditions. As the first week stretched into a second, the search expanded to cover an enormous area radiating out from Derek's truck. Teams systematically combed through valleys, ridges, and creek beds, looking for any trace of the missing hunter. They found old campsites, discarded equipment from previous hunting seasons, and abundant sign of the black bears Derek had come to hunt. But they found no trace of Derek himself, no footprints, no dropped equipment, no indication that he had ever set foot in the vast wilderness that seemed to have swallowed him completely. David Crown, the local Forest Service ranger who knew the hunting area as well as anyone, joined the search effort and provided crucial knowledge about the terrain's hidden dangers. The region was riddled with steep ravines and unstable ground that could easily claim an unwary hiker. There were also numerous abandoned mine shafts from the area's gold rush era, some hidden by decades of vegetation growth. Crown guided search teams to these potential hazard areas, but systematic searches revealed nothing. The psychological toll on the searchers began to mount as days passed without discovery. These were Derek's friends and neighbors, men who had hunted and fished alongside him for years. They knew his skills, his caution, and his deep familiarity with the forest. The fact that such an experienced outdoorsman could simply vanish without a trace challenged their understanding of wilderness survival and their confidence in their own safety during future expeditions. Patricia Lansing established a command post at their cabin, coordinating with authorities and maintaining detailed logs of search progress. She barely slept, sustained by coffee and the faint hope that each radio transmission might bring news of Derek's discovery. Friends and family members took turns staying with her, recognizing that the waiting was perhaps more torturous than the physical demands faced by the search teams. As October gave way to November and the first heavy snows began to accumulate in the mountains, the official search was gradually scaled back. The volunteer teams had covered hundreds of square miles without finding so much as a footprint. The harsh reality was that the Alaskan wilderness could easily hide a man forever, and winter was making further search efforts increasingly dangerous for the searchers themselves. Derek Lansing had joined the ranks of those who had simply walked into the forest and never returned. The official search and rescue operation was declared concluded on November 8, 2013, nearly a month after Derek Lansing had disappeared into the Alaskan wilderness. The decision was made with heavy hearts by Trooper Sergeant Bridges, who understood that the approaching winter made further organized searches both futile and dangerous. The early snows had already begun to bury any potential evidence under a white blanket that would persist until spring. Derek's case was transferred from an active rescue operation to a missing person investigation, a bureaucratic shift that felt like a death sentence to those who had spent weeks hoping for his safe return. Patricia Lansing refused to accept the conclusion that her husband was gone forever. Throughout the brutal winter of 2013 to 2014, she organized private search efforts whenever weather conditions permitted. She hired experienced local guides to escort her into the remote areas where the official search had been concentrated, and she walked the same trails that dozens of volunteers had already covered. Her determination was both inspiring and heartbreaking to the small community of Ketchikan, which had rallied around the Lansing family during the initial search efforts. The theories about Derek's disappearance were numerous and troubling. The most commonly accepted explanation among local hunters was that he had suffered some kind of accident in the challenging terrain. The forest was riddled with hidden dangers that could easily claim even an experienced outdoorsman. A sudden fall into one of the many ravines, a slip on wet rocks near a creek, or an encounter with unstable ground near an old mine shaft could have left Derek injured and unable to signal for help. The dense undergrowth could easily conceal a body just yards from a main trail, and the scavenger animals that were abundant in the region would make quick work of any remains. Another theory that gained traction among some searchers was the possibility of a bear attack. The region's black bear population was healthy and active in October as the animals prepared for winter hibernation. While fatal bear attacks were relatively rare in Alaska, they were far from unknown, particularly when hunters inadvertently came between a sow and her cubs or surprised a bear at a food source. The absence of any torn clothing, scattered equipment, or other signs of a struggle made this theory less likely, but the dense forest could easily have hidden the evidence of such an encounter. A more disturbing possibility that was quietly discussed among law enforcement was the potential for foul play. The remote hunting area was occasionally used by individuals involved in illegal activities, including drug trafficking and illegal logging operations. Derek might have stumbled upon something he wasn't supposed to see and been killed to protect someone's criminal enterprise. However, this theory was undermined by Derek's reputation as a man who minded his own business and the lack of any evidence suggesting criminal activity in the specific area where he had planned to hunt. Detective Ray Murphy of the Ketchikan Police Department was assigned as the lead investigator for Derek's disappearance. Murphy was a methodical man who had handled dozens of missing person cases during his 15-year career, though few had involved someone with Derek's level of wilderness experience. He spent months reviewing every aspect of Derek's life, looking for any indication that the disappearance might have been intentional or connected to personal problems. Financial records showed no unusual activity. Interviews with friends and family revealed no marital problems, no debts, no enemies, and no reason Derek might have wanted to disappear voluntarily. Murphy's investigation expanded to include a thorough examination of Derek's hunting equipment and preparation. He consulted with survival experts and experienced hunters who confirmed that Derek had been properly equipped for his planned expedition. The satellite communicator found in Derek's truck was examined by technicians who confirmed it had been in perfect working order. If Derek had been injured but conscious, he should have been able to summon help. The fact that no distress signal had ever been transmitted suggested that whatever happened to Derek had been sudden and catastrophic. As 2014 passed into 2015, Patricia Lansing gradually accepted that her husband was not coming home. The grief counselor she had been seeing helped her understand that closure didn't necessarily require a body or a definitive explanation of what had happened. Derek had died doing something he loved in a place that had given his life meaning, and perhaps that was enough. She began the painful process of settling Derek's affairs, selling the fishing boat he would never use again, and learning to live alone in the cabin they had shared for 12 years. The annual hunting season served as a painful reminder for the entire Ketchikan hunting community. Many of Derek's friends found themselves reluctant to venture into the same remote areas where he had vanished, and several hunters began traveling in pairs rather than making the solitary expeditions that had once been common. Derek's disappearance had shattered the illusion of safety that experience and preparation could provide in the Alaskan wilderness, leaving behind a lingering unease that affected the entire community. Detective Murphy continued to receive occasional tips and reported sightings of Derek, but each lead proved to be either mistaken identity or wishful thinking. A hiker reported seeing a bearded man matching Derek's description near a remote lake in 2015, but investigation revealed the man to be a different missing person from another case entirely. A trapper claimed to have found a rifle similar to Derek's Winchester, but examination showed it to be a different model entirely. Each false lead was both disappointing and emotionally exhausting for Patricia, who found herself caught between hope and despair with each new development. The case file for Derek Lansing grew thicker with time, filled with search reports, interview transcripts, and detailed maps marking every area that had been systematically examined. Murphy kept the file active, reviewing it periodically and following up on any new information that emerged. He had seen too many cases solved years after they had gone cold to give up entirely, but he understood that the likelihood of finding Derek decreased with each passing season. In the spring of 2016, Patricia made the difficult decision to hold a memorial service for Derek without a body to bury. The service was held at the small church in Ketchikan where they had been married 15 years earlier, and it was attended by hundreds of people from the close-knit community. Friends shared stories of Derek's generosity, his knowledge of the wilderness, and his quiet strength. The memorial provided some measure of closure for Patricia and the community, though questions about Derek's fate continued to haunt everyone who had known him. The memorial also marked a turning point in how the community talked about Derek's disappearance. Rather than focusing on the mystery of what had happened, people began to celebrate the life he had lived and the impact he had made on those around him. His fishing buddies shared stories of his patience in teaching younger fishermen the tricks of the trade. Fellow hunters remembered his willingness to help track wounded game or assist with difficult retrieval operations in challenging terrain. Derek's legacy became less about his mysterious disappearance and more about the generous, skilled man he had been. If you've ever wondered how someone can simply vanish without a trace in our modern world, Derek Lansing's story shows just how vast and unforgiving the wilderness can be, even for those who know it best. The Alaskan forest had swallowed a man whole, leaving behind only questions and grief. But sometimes the wilderness keeps its secrets for years before reluctantly giving them up, and Derek's story was far from over. As 2016 turned to 2017, the active investigation into Derek's disappearance was officially suspended. Detective Murphy had exhausted every lead and interviewed every person who might have had relevant information. The file was moved to the cold case section, joining dozens of other unsolved mysteries that had accumulated over the years. Murphy made a note in the file that the case should be reviewed annually, and he instructed patrol officers to be alert for any evidence that might emerge during routine wilderness patrols or unrelated investigations. Patricia Lansing had begun to rebuild her life, though Derek's absence remained a constant presence in everything she did. She kept his hunting rifle mounted above the fireplace and maintained the small garden they had worked together behind the cabin. She found part-time work at the local library, grateful for the quiet routine and the gentle company of books. The community continued to support her, checking in regularly and including her in social activities, understanding that isolation would only deepen her grief. The hunting seasons of 2016 and 2017 passed without incident, though Derek's disappearance continued to influence how local hunters approached their expeditions. More people invested in better emergency communication equipment, and the practice of hunting alone became less common. The local sporting goods store began offering wilderness safety courses that emphasized the importance of detailed trip planning and regular check-ins with family members. In a strange way, Derek's disappearance had made the entire hunting community more safety-conscious, though the fundamental risks of venturing into the remote wilderness remained unchanged. Detective Murphy retired in early 2017, passing Derek's case file to his replacement, Detective Lisa Hayes. Hayes was younger and newer to Alaska, but she brought fresh eyes to the cold case files and a determination to solve mysteries that her predecessors had been unable to crack. She spent her first few months reviewing Derek's case thoroughly, looking for any angle that might have been missed during the initial investigation. She found the work thorough and professional, with no obvious oversights or unexplored leads. The breakthrough in Derek Lansing's case came from an entirely unexpected source in the early summer of 2017. Jake Brennan was a freelance wildlife photographer from Montana who had traveled to Alaska to document the region's recovering wolf population for a national magazine assignment. Brennan was an experienced outdoorsman himself, though his expertise lay more in patience and observation than in hunting. He had spent 2 weeks in the remote wilderness surrounding Ketchikan, moving carefully through the forest with his telephoto lenses and camping equipment, hoping to capture images of wolves in their natural habitat. Brennan's assignment had taken him far beyond the areas typically frequented by hunters and hikers, into sections of the Tongass National Forest that saw human visitors perhaps once or twice a year. He was working alone, as wildlife photographers often did, relying on his satellite communication device and detailed planning to ensure his safety in the vast wilderness. His methodical approach to documentation required him to spend long hours in observation posts, sometimes remaining motionless for entire days while waiting for wildlife to appear. On the morning of June 23, 2017, Brennan was following a game trail that wound through a particularly dense section of forest roughly 25 miles from the nearest logging road. The area was a natural corridor for wildlife movement, carved between two steep ridges that forced animals to funnel through the narrow valley. It was exactly the type of location where Brennan hoped to encounter and photograph the elusive wolf packs he had come to document. The discovery came suddenly and without warning. Brennan was moving slowly along the faint trail, his heavy camera equipment making progress difficult through the thick undergrowth. He paused to check his GPS coordinates and ensure he was still following his planned route when a splash of unnatural color caught his peripheral vision. 20 yards to his left, partially hidden beneath a fallen spruce tree and nearly obscured by 4 years of accumulated forest debris, was something that clearly didn't belong in the wilderness. Brennan's first instinct was curiosity rather than alarm. The Alaskan wilderness was littered with the remnants of human activity from decades of logging, mining, and hunting. Old equipment, abandoned campsites, and forgotten gear were common discoveries for anyone who ventured far enough into the remote areas. He assumed he had stumbled upon another piece of discarded hunting equipment or camping gear, perhaps lost or abandoned by a previous visitor to the area. As he moved closer to investigate, the true nature of his discovery became horrifyingly clear. What had initially appeared to be a piece of brightly colored fabric was actually the tattered remains of a hunting jacket, still partially clothing what was unmistakably a human skeleton. The bones were scattered across a roughly circular area about 15 feet in diameter, clearly disturbed and moved by scavenging animals over the course of several years. Some of the larger bones, including the skull and femurs, were still partially connected by dried tendons and scraps of clothing, but many of the smaller bones had been dragged away from the main site by the forest's efficient cleanup crew of ravens, foxes, and other scavengers. Brennan's professional training as a photographer had exposed him to various disturbing scenes, but nothing had prepared him for this moment. His hands shook as he fumbled for his satellite communicator, his mind racing to process what he had found. The remoteness of the location, the scattered nature of the remains, and the obvious signs of animal scavenging painted a grim picture of someone who had died alone in the wilderness and been left to the mercy of nature's recycling process. The scene told a story of violence and desperation that was immediately apparent even to someone without forensic training. The skeleton's position and the distribution of the remains suggested that death had not come peacefully. Several of the larger bones showed obvious signs of trauma, including what appeared to be deep gouges and fractures that could only have been caused by a large predator. The skull, though partially damaged by years of weathering, showed clear evidence of massive trauma that had likely been fatal. Most disturbing was the evidence of a prolonged struggle that was written in the arrangement of the remains. The bones were not clustered in the peaceful pose of someone who had simply succumbed to exposure or a medical emergency. Instead, they were scattered in a pattern that suggested violent movement and desperate resistance. Scraps of torn clothing were tangled in the surrounding vegetation, and the ground itself showed signs of the disturbance, even after 4 years of forest regeneration. Brennan's emergency call to the Alaska State Troopers was received at 11:47 a.m. by dispatcher Carol Wright, whose 20-year career had prepared her for many disturbing calls but few as remote and challenging as this one. Brennan's description of the location made it clear that reaching the scene would require a significant logistical effort, possibly including helicopter support if weather conditions permitted. Wright immediately contacted Trooper Sergeant Mike Holbrook, who had taken over much of the wilderness response duties following Tom Bridges' transfer to Anchorage the previous year. Holbrook was a former military police officer who had developed a reputation for handling complex wilderness investigations with patience and thoroughness. His initial conversation with Brennan focused on securing the scene and ensuring the photographer's own safety while help was en route. Holbrook instructed Brennan to move away from the remains, establish a camp at a safe distance, and maintain regular radio contact while a response team was organized. The recovery operation began immediately, but the remote location and challenging terrain meant that reaching Brennan's discovery would take most of the day. A helicopter was dispatched from Juneau carrying a team that included Trooper Holbrook, Detective Hayes, and Dr. Amanda Russell, the regional forensic expert who would be responsible for the initial examination of the remains. The flight path took them over hundreds of square miles of unbroken forest, emphasizing just how isolated Brennan's discovery truly was. The magnitude of the wilderness became starkly apparent as the helicopter navigated between mountain peaks and over vast expanses of forest that showed no sign of human presence. The pilot, Captain Steve Willis, was an experienced bush pilot who knew the region well, but even he was impressed by the remoteness of their destination. The location was so far from any established trail or landmark that it would have been nearly impossible to find without Brennan's precise GPS coordinates. When the helicopter finally reached Brennan's location and set down in a small clearing roughly half a mile from the discovery site, the team faced a challenging hike through dense undergrowth to reach the remains. Brennan had done an excellent job of marking the route with bright orange surveyor's tape, but progress was still slow due to the thick vegetation and uneven terrain. The forest here was primeval, untouched by logging or development, with massive trees that had been growing for centuries and an understory so thick it blocked most of the afternoon sunlight. Dr. Russell's initial examination of the scene confirmed Brennan's assessment that this was a case of violent death rather than natural causes. The scattered bones, the signs of scavenging, and the obvious trauma to several of the major skeletal elements all pointed to a predator attack of unusual severity. Most bear attacks on humans were brief and resulted in specific patterns of injury, but this scene suggested a prolonged encounter that had ended with complete consumption of the soft tissues and scattering of the skeletal remains. The forensic team worked methodically to document and recover every piece of evidence from the scene. Each bone fragment was photographed in place before being carefully collected and catalogued. Scraps of clothing were preserved for later analysis, and soil samples were taken from around the primary scatter area. The process was slow and painstaking, made more difficult by the fading daylight and the constant threat of bears drawn by the scent of the investigation team. As Dr. Russell continued her preliminary examination, one discovery stood out as particularly significant. Partially buried beneath a layer of forest debris near the skull was a severely damaged but still recognizable hunting license holder. The plastic case had protected its contents from complete destruction, and inside was a hunting license issued to Derek Lansing for the 2013 season. After nearly 4 years of searching, Derek had finally been found. The news of Derek's discovery spread quickly through the small community of Ketchikan, bringing with it a complex mixture of relief and renewed grief. Patricia Lansing received the call from Detective Hayes at her job at the library, where she had been helping a young student with a research project. The detective's voice was gentle but direct as she explained that human remains had been found in a remote area of the forest and that Derek's hunting license had been discovered at the scene. For Patricia, the confirmation of Derek's death was both devastating and oddly comforting. The years of uncertainty had been a unique form of torture, leaving her suspended between grief and hope, unable to fully mourn or move forward. Now, finally, she would have answers, even if those answers were not the ones she had prayed for during the long nights of waiting and wondering. The discovery of Derek's remains raised immediate questions about what had happened during his final hours in the wilderness. The evidence at the scene suggested a bear attack of unusual violence, but several aspects of the case didn't fit the typical pattern of human-bear encounters in the region. Most concerning was the location itself, which was far from Derek's intended hunting area and seemed to indicate he had become lost or had deliberately traveled much farther into the wilderness than planned. Detective Hayes began the process of reconstructing Derek's final expedition, using the location of his remains as a new starting point for understanding what had gone wrong during his planned 3-day hunt. The distance between where his truck had been found and where his body was discovered suggested a journey of at least 15 miles through some of the most challenging terrain in the region. It was a journey that raised troubling questions about why an experienced hunter like Derek had ventured so far from his planned route. This incredible story of survival and tragedy shows us how quickly things can change in the wilderness, even for the most experienced outdoorsman. What happened to Derek in those final hours would soon become clear as investigators pieced together the evidence from his remote grave. The forensic analysis of Derek Lansing's remains began in earnest at the State Crime Laboratory in Anchorage, where Dr. Amanda Russell conducted a thorough examination that would ultimately reveal the horrific sequence of events leading to his death. The bones told a story of survival, desperation, and ultimately, a violent end that was far worse than anyone had imagined during the years of searching and speculation. Dr. Russell's initial examination confirmed that the skeletal remains belonged to a male in his late 30s, consistent with Derek's age at the time of his disappearance. Dental records provided absolute confirmation of identity. finally putting to rest any lingering hope that Derek might still be alive somewhere. The examination also revealed crucial details about the condition of his body at the time of death and the circumstances that had led to his final confrontation with the Alaskan wilderness. The most significant discovery was evidence that Derek had been injured long before his encounter with the bear that ultimately killed him. X-ray analysis of his left leg bones revealed a complex fracture of the tibia that showed signs of partial healing, indicating that the injury had occurred several days or possibly weeks before his death. The fracture was severe enough that Derek would have been unable to walk normally, and the lack of proper medical treatment had led to infection and complications that would have weakened him considerably. Dr. Russell's reconstruction of events painted a picture of gradual catastrophe rather than sudden disaster. Derek had somehow sustained a serious leg injury early in his hunting expedition, possibly from a fall or mishap while navigating the challenging terrain. Unable to hike back to his truck, he had been forced to establish a temporary camp in the remote wilderness while hoping for rescue or attempting to heal enough to make the journey out on his own. The evidence suggested that Derek had survived in the wilderness for an extended period after his initial injury. Analysis of his remaining clothing revealed repairs made with materials that would have been available from his hunting pack, indicating that he had been conscious and able to maintain his gear for some time after becoming stranded. Scratches on his belt buckle and knife handle showed signs of regular use, suggesting he had been actively working to survive rather than simply waiting to die. Detective Hayes worked closely with Dr. Russell to understand the timeline of Derek's final weeks. The location where his remains were found was roughly 8 miles from his intended hunting area, but the route between the two locations followed a logical path along creek beds and game trails. It appeared that Derek, after injuring his leg, had attempted to follow water sources toward civilization, a sound survival strategy that unfortunately led him deeper into the wilderness rather than toward help. The investigation revealed that Derek's satellite communicator, which should have been his lifeline in an emergency, had been damaged beyond use. Fragments of the device recovered from the scene showed impact damage consistent with a hard fall, possibly the same incident that had injured his leg. Without the ability to call for help, Derek had been forced to rely on his wilderness skills and hope that someone would eventually find him or that he would recover enough to walk out on his own. Analysis of the campsite where Derek's remains were found provided disturbing insights into his final days. The scattered debris included remnants of a makeshift shelter constructed from branches and his hunting tarp, suggesting he had been in the location for at least several days before his death. Food wrappers and evidence of fishing activity indicated he had been actively working to supplement his dwindling supplies, though malnutrition and infection from his untreated leg wound would have been taking an increasing toll. The bear attack itself appeared to have occurred during Derek's final attempt to move from his temporary campsite. The distribution of bones and torn equipment suggested that he had been packing his gear when the bear encountered him, possibly while he was vulnerable and unable to move quickly due to his injured leg. The attack had been swift and devastating, with evidence indicating that Derek had little opportunity to defend himself or escape. Dr. Russell's analysis of the skeletal trauma revealed the full horror of Derek's final moments. The bear had been a large adult, probably weighing over 400 pounds, and the attack had been unusually prolonged and violent. Most bear encounters with humans were brief, with the animal typically breaking off the attack once the perceived threat was neutralized. This attack had continued far beyond what was typical, suggesting that the bear may have been defending cubs or had been habituated to human presence in ways that made it more aggressive than normal. The evidence also revealed something that made Derek's story even more tragic. Among his scattered belongings, investigators found a crude calendar scratched into a piece of bark, with marks indicating that Derek had been keeping track of the days since his initial injury. The marks suggested he had survived in the wilderness for nearly 3 weeks after becoming stranded, dying just days before the first search teams had reached the general area where he was camped. Detective Hayes found this timeline particularly heartbreaking because it meant Derek had been alive and fighting for survival during much of the initial search effort. If the search teams had expanded their perimeter just slightly further, or if Derek had been able to signal his location in some way, he might have been rescued. The knowledge that he had been so close to help while enduring weeks of pain and desperation added another layer of tragedy to an already devastating situation. The investigation also revealed why Derek had never been found during the extensive search efforts in 2013. His final campsite was located in a narrow ravine that was not visible from the air and was far enough off the main search grid that ground teams had never reached it. The thick forest canopy would have made it impossible for helicopters to spot him even if they had flown directly overhead, and his improvised shelter had been designed to blend with the natural surroundings. Wildlife experts consulted during the investigation confirmed that Derek's encounter with the bear was consistent with the behavior patterns of a female with cubs protecting her young. The timing of the attack, in late October or early November, aligned with the period when bear families would have been searching for final food sources before winter hibernation. Derek's campsite near a creek with spawning salmon would have been an attractive location for bears, creating the conditions for a deadly confrontation. The discovery of Derek's remains also provided closure for the broader investigation into his disappearance. DNA analysis confirmed that blood traces found on some of his equipment matched Derek's genetic profile, eliminating any possibility that he had been the victim of foul play. The evidence clearly indicated that his death was the result of a wilderness accident followed by a predator attack, bringing to an end years of speculation about other possible causes. For the Ketchikan community, Derek's discovery represented both an ending and a beginning. The mystery that had haunted local hunters for nearly 4 years was finally solved, but the knowledge of what Derek had endured during his final weeks created a new understanding of the wilderness's capacity for both beauty and horror. His story became a cautionary tale about the importance of proper emergency equipment and the need for detailed safety protocols when venturing into remote areas. Patricia Lansing's reaction to the full details of her husband's final weeks was complex and evolving. The knowledge that Derek had fought so hard to survive, that he had lived for weeks after his initial injury, was both comforting and agonizing. She found some solace in understanding that he had not died immediately from an accident but had demonstrated the resilience and wilderness skills that had always been such an important part of his identity. The forensic team's work also revealed personal details that provided Patricia with unexpected comfort. Among Derek's belongings was a small notebook in which he had written messages to her during his final days. The pages were water-damaged and partially illegible, but enough text remained to show that his thoughts had been focused on his love for her and his determination to return home. One passage, written in Derek's careful handwriting, reads simply, "Patricia, if you find this, know that I fought to come back to you every single day." Detective Hayes made sure that Patricia received copies of all the personal effects that could be recovered and preserved. Along with the notebook, there were photographs from Derek's camera that showed the beautiful but unforgiving landscape where he had spent his final weeks. The images revealed his photographer's eye for the wilderness, capturing moments of natural beauty even while he was struggling to survive in desperate circumstances. The investigation concluded with a comprehensive report that detailed every aspect of Derek's disappearance, survival, and death. The report would become a reference document for future wilderness safety training and search and rescue protocols, ensuring that Derek's experience would contribute to preventing similar tragedies in the future. His story had become part of the collective knowledge that Alaskan outdoorsmen would carry with them into the wilderness, a reminder of both the risks they faced and the importance of preparation and caution. As investigators prepared their final reports and the community began to process the full truth of what had happened to Derek Lansing, one question remained that would challenge everything they thought they knew about wilderness survival and the relationship between humans and the natural world that surrounded them. The final piece of Derek Lansing's tragic puzzle emerged during the last phase of Dr. Russell's forensic analysis, revealing a detail that would forever change how the Alaskan hunting community understood wilderness survival. Hidden among Derek's personal effects, partially preserved in a waterproof pouch he had carried in his jacket pocket, was a detailed survival journal that chronicled his 3 weeks of desperate struggle in the remote wilderness. The journal entries, written in Derek's steady handwriting despite his deteriorating condition, provided a day-by-day account of his fight for survival that was both inspiring and heartbreaking. The journal began on October 18, 2013, 3 days after Derek had originally planned to return home. The first entry described his initial fall while crossing a rain-slicked log bridge over a creek, an accident that had shattered his left leg and destroyed his satellite communicator in a single catastrophic moment. Derek's medical training from his years as a volunteer firefighter had allowed him to recognize the severity of his injury immediately, and his first journal entries focused on his attempts to splint the leg and control the bleeding using materials from his hunting pack. Reading Derek's own words about his predicament was profoundly moving for everyone involved in the investigation. His writing revealed a man who understood the gravity of his situation but refused to surrender to despair. He methodically documented his efforts to signal for help, including building signal fires and arranging rocks in patterns that might be visible from aircraft. He described his careful rationing of food and his successful efforts to catch fish from the creek that ran near his improvised campsite. The journal entries also revealed Derek's growing awareness that he was far from the search areas where rescue teams would be looking for him. His injured leg had forced him to follow the path of least resistance along creek beds and valley floors, leading him progressively deeper into the wilderness rather than toward civilization. By the end of his first week in the wilderness, Derek had realized that rescue was unlikely and that his survival depended entirely on his own resourcefulness and determination. Dr. Russell's medical analysis of the journal entries provided insights into Derek's physical and mental condition during his final weeks. His handwriting remained steady and legible for the first 2 weeks, but gradually became more erratic as infection from his untreated leg wound began to affect his cognitive function. Despite his deteriorating condition, Derek continued to make detailed observations about weather patterns, wildlife behavior, and his own survival strategies, demonstrating the methodical mindset that had kept him alive far longer than should have been possible. The most remarkable aspect of Derek's journal was its tone of determination rather than despair. Even as his situation became increasingly desperate, he continued to write about his plans for getting home and his love for Patricia. He described dreams of the warm cabin they shared and the meals they would cook together when he finally returned. His unwavering optimism in the face of overwhelming odds revealed a strength of character that impressed everyone who read his final words. Detective Hayes worked with handwriting experts to verify the authenticity of the journal entries and establish a precise timeline of Derek's final weeks. The analysis confirmed that Derek had written his last entry on November 6, describing his decision to attempt one final push toward what he believed was a logging road roughly 5 miles to the east. That entry ended with the words, "If something happens to me, tell Patricia that I never stopped fighting to come home to her." The bear attack had occurred either that same day or the following morning, as Derek was breaking camp for his final attempt to reach civilization. Evidence at the scene suggested that he had been packing his improvised shelter when the bear, likely a female with cubs, had discovered his campsite. The attack had been swift and decisive, ending Derek's remarkable 3-week survival story in moments of violence that contrasted sharply with the quiet courage he had shown during his weeks of solitude. The publication of selected excerpts from Derek's journal, with Patricia's permission, had a profound impact on the Alaskan hunting and outdoor community. His detailed descriptions of improvised survival techniques, his methods for finding and purifying water, and his strategies for maintaining mental health during extended isolation became required reading for wilderness safety courses throughout the state. Derek's experience demonstrated that survival in the Alaskan wilderness required not just physical skills but extraordinary mental resilience and the ability to adapt to constantly changing circumstances. Patricia Lansing found unexpected comfort in reading her husband's final thoughts, despite the pain of understanding what he had endured during those 3 weeks of isolation. The journal revealed that Derek had never lost hope of returning to her and that his love for her had been one of the primary motivations driving his survival efforts. She decided to establish the Derek Lansing Wilderness Safety Foundation, an organization dedicated to improving emergency communication technology and survival education for outdoor enthusiasts. The foundation's first initiative was to work with satellite communication companies to develop more robust emergency devices that could withstand the kind of impact that had destroyed Derek's communicator. The foundation also funded wilderness survival courses that emphasized the psychological aspects of extended survival situations, recognizing that mental resilience was often the determining factor in life or death scenarios. Patricia believed that Derek's experience could help prevent similar tragedies and ensure that his death would contribute to saving other lives. The Ketchikan hunting community underwent significant changes in the wake of Derek's discovery and the revelation of his survival story. Local outfitters began requiring clients to carry backup emergency communication devices, and many hunters started traveling in pairs even during expeditions that had traditionally been solitary pursuits. The sporting goods stores in town began stocking more sophisticated survival gear, and wilderness safety courses became as popular as hunting safety classes. The annual hunting season that followed Derek's discovery was marked by a heightened awareness of the wilderness's dangers and a renewed respect for proper preparation and safety protocols. Many hunters reported that Derek's story had changed their approach to expedition planning, making them more conservative in their route selection and more diligent about maintaining communication schedules with family members. His experience had served as a sobering reminder that even the most experienced outdoorsmen remained vulnerable to the unpredictable nature of the Alaskan wilderness. If you're planning your own wilderness adventures, Derek's story serves as a crucial reminder of why proper preparation and emergency communication can mean the difference between life and death in remote areas. His remarkable survival skills and unwavering determination show us what the human spirit can endure, even in the most desperate circumstances. Detective Hayes officially closed Derek's case in the spring of 2018, nearly 5 years after his initial disappearance. The investigation had provided complete answers to the questions that had haunted his family and community for so long, and the forensic evidence had eliminated any remaining mysteries about his final weeks. The case file became one of the most thoroughly documented wilderness survival and fatality investigations in Alaska's history, providing valuable insights for future search and rescue operations. The memorial service that Patricia organized for Derek in 2018 was different from the one held 2 years earlier when his fate was still unknown. This service was a celebration of his remarkable survival skills and his refusal to surrender in the face of overwhelming odds. The gathered community heard readings from Derek's journal that demonstrated his courage, his love for his family, and his deep knowledge of the wilderness that had ultimately claimed his life but had also been his greatest passion. Dr. Russell's final forensic report concluded that Derek Lansing had demonstrated survival skills that were truly exceptional, managing to stay alive in harsh conditions for far longer than most experts would have thought possible. His improvised shelter, his fishing techniques, and his water purification methods had all been textbook examples of wilderness survival, executed under conditions of extreme stress and physical disability. The fact that he had maintained his mental clarity and emotional strength throughout his ordeal was a testament to both his character and his deep understanding of wilderness survival principles. The legacy of Derek's story extended far beyond the borders of Alaska. Wilderness safety organizations across North America began incorporating his survival techniques into their training programs, and his journal entries became case study material for survival psychology courses. His experience demonstrated that survival in extreme situations required not just technical skills but also the mental fortitude to maintain hope and continue fighting even when circumstances seemed hopeless. Patricia continued to live in the cabin she had shared with Derek, finding peace in the familiar surroundings and the knowledge that she finally understood what had happened during those terrible weeks when he had been fighting for his life in the wilderness. She kept his hunting rifle mounted above the fireplace and maintained the small garden they had worked on together, finding comfort in the routines they had shared and the memories of their 12 years of marriage. The Derek Lansing Wilderness Safety Foundation grew into a respected organization that provided grants for emergency communication research and funded wilderness survival education programs throughout Alaska and the Pacific Northwest. Patricia's work with the foundation gave her a sense of purpose and allowed her to honor Derek's memory by helping to prevent similar tragedies from befalling other families. Derek's story became part of the oral tradition of Alaskan hunters, passed down through generations as both a cautionary tale and an inspiring example of human resilience. His 3 weeks of survival in the remote wilderness, documented in his own words, stood as proof that the human spirit could endure extraordinary hardships when guided by knowledge, determination, and love. The fact that he had come so close to survival, dying just days before rescue teams reached the general area where he was camped, served as a reminder of how narrow the margin between life and death could be in the unforgiving wilderness. The wilderness that had claimed Derek Lansing's life continued to draw hunters, photographers, and adventurers who understood both its beauty and its dangers. His story served as a reminder that respect for the natural world and proper preparation were essential for anyone who chose to venture into the remote corners of Alaska. Derek had died doing what he loved, in a place that had given his life meaning, but his legacy ensured that future generations of outdoorsmen would be better prepared for the challenges they might face in the vast and unforgiving wilderness that defined the last frontier.